is Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson, right? So if you recall, Johnson had a plan. It was called 10% plus, which was the idea that same sort of loyalty oaths, but you have to kiss the ring, so to speak, right? Like he's an old poor boy getting to punish the aristocratic type for making them come up. Well, Republicans, are not going to allow these Southern Democrats who are ex-Confederates to sit, and so they actually in the Congress, so they actually bar their admission in this crucial year of 1865. This is December 65. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War is ended, and a Joint Committee on Reconstruction is created. I'll go over some of the key leaders of that in a little bit. But one of the first major bills that Congress passed in the start of the next year was the Freedmen's Bureau, which we've already talked about. The goal of the Freedmen's Bureau is to provide education and land reform. Johnson vetoes it, and Congress overrides it. First time it's ever happened in history, right? They then pass a brand new law called the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And in that if you go and look at the future Civil Rights Act, it's very interesting how similar elements of these two bills are. Civil rights would have guaranteed citizenship and things like that. But Johnson vetoed it. And so once again, Congress overrode his veto. So at this point, it is very clear under the current nature of the of Congress and the president, anything he vetoes, they're just going to override. Okay, strongly Republican. And so this is the first time this happened. So at the same time, it's been working its way slowly through the committee process is the next amendment to the Constitution. So there'll be three amendments that are called the Civil War amendments that you should know. Obviously, the 13th Amendment was ratified before the end of the Civil War, the abolishing of slavery in America. But the 14th Amendment is extraordinarily complicated. And guys, a good chunk of AP government is going to be about the 14th Amendment. So let's talk about the ones that are sort of like the first one that everybody kind of remembers. So the first one defines citizenship. So all persons born in America are citizens of the United States. So that's a very important line. All persons born in, which means, and I've given you the two methods in which citizenship by birth is acquired. And of course, naturalized citizens, this will apply to the civil rights, but born or naturalized. So what this means is jus sanguinis means your right of your blood, your heredity. So if your father or mother or both are American citizens, you are an American citizen by birth, automatically, okay? If you are born on American soil, you are an American citizen by that fact alone. So even if your parents are here illegally, if you were born in America, or if you're born in an American hospital somewhere around the world, like on a military base or something like that, you're an American citizen. So what this meant was civil rights would be guaranteed to free people. But I want to really tell you something else here. It says no state can deny life, liberty, or property. Okay, and this is huge without due process. Because before, due process was only a guarantee of the Fifth Amendment. And that meant the national government could not deprive you of life, liberty, or property without due process. For example, many American states, as late as the 1830s, still had established religions. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law establishing religion. Congress shall make. That doesn't mean Virginia shall make. The good news is Virginia has the statute of religious freedom, right? But you literally have, think about your Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights did not apply to the states, only to the nation. And so it's only really a 20th century phenomenon, starting in 1919, that the Bill of Rights begins to apply to the state, starting with freedom of speech. So in other words, we call this, by the way, in AP government terms, selective incorporation. It was as recent as 2-3 years ago that the Second Amendment was incorporated. Before 3 years ago, states could ban firearm types, wholesale. So this is what I mean by the evolving of the Constitution. But its initial purpose, as very clear, is to make sure that African Americans were citizens. Thus, they had the right to juries and trials and all the rights of citizenship. Okay, so usually the sort of elementary response to the 14th Amendment is it guaranteed citizenship or civil rights for Black people. It's not really true. It did more than that, but that's the easiest way to relate it to the Civil War. The second, and this goes to that issue they were dealing with, it wanted to make sure that anyone engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States could not hold high office, could not hold federal office. That's the component that critics of President Trump are trying to use now. That President Trump, they argue, incited rebellion on January the 6th against the United States. So that's where that comes in, this 14th Amendment. Because if you do this, you can no longer hold political office at the national level. Okay? So that was to keep Confederates from showing up in Congress ever again. Third, I love number 3, because I feel like this is the only thing that we can check the federal government on anymore. Number 3 said, the national debt of the United States is sovereign. It must be paid. And the Confederate debt would be anybody who loaned money to the Confederacy would not get paid. So if you backed the Confederacy as a lender, be it a bank or a foreign country's bank, you weren't getting any of your money. But it said the federal government's debt must be paid. So today, when I see a $28 trillion national debt, and I look in the Constitution and says it must be paid, that tells me Congress can't not pay it. Now, when they pay it is the question, right? But they have to pay their bills. They can't not pay the federal government. And then this last one, they tried in the 14th Amendment to fix Black voting. They said, if you deny the right to vote based on race, you will lose representation equal to that denial. Right? So in other words, if 30,000 Black men can't vote, then you will lose the representation that 30,000 Black men would create under the census. Very complicated. They were trying to tell the states, let Black people vote. But for the first time in the history of our Constitution, they inserted the word male. And that's what really angered feminists, because they're like, why'd you do that? You didn't have to put the word male there. You just left citizen there, right? So the 14th Amendment doesn't really guarantee the right to vote. It penalizes you if you don't guarantee the right to vote, right? Well, naturally, Southern states are going to not do this. So that leads to the 15th Amendment, which we'll get to later, okay? But particularly the right to vote having the word male in it is going to be very frustrating for women like Susan B. Anthony, for example, who opposed the 14th Amendment as a result of it, okay? But please know the 14th Amendment, a landmark amendment in so many ways. By the way, this guaranteeing civil rights applies to immigrants who become citizens too. There'll be a famous case called U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark. He's a Chinese immigrant who became American. So now the rights of citizenship are defined very clearly because of the 14th Amendment, and that's a crucial change in our Constitution. So you have an election, and now this is what we call a midterm election, which means not a presidential election, but usually an election for all of the House of Representatives and for 1/3 of the U.S. Senate. So we call these midterms, okay? They're often seen as a reflection on how the president is doing at that time. Usually, presidents gain seats for their party during this period. Like they'll get more of their party seats, usually, not always. Obama lost seats, but President Trump gained some in the Congress. So Johnson does something that's pretty remarkable. Keep in mind, Johnson is not a Republican, okay? He was a war Democrat, but he's definitely a Democrat. So he goes out on the campaign trail and he tries to drum out support, for his agenda, the 10% plus plan and what the Democrats are doing. The problem is Johnson in this, it backfires. It doesn't work at all. In many ways, his behavior is very unpresidential. He gets in shouting sort of occasions with people, like he starts yelling at them from the train and stuff. And this totally backfires. When people will see how ridiculous Johnson is, behaving, then they vote Republican. And so when they do that, they don't only just get a veto proof, it's like a super veto proof. It's like 3-1 majority. So they have, the Republicans control the entire Congress, for lack of a better word. And Johnson probably should have read the writing on the wall there, but he didn't. He continues to sort of vilify Congress. And he talks with very, very hostile language, like shedding his blood to preserve. This is the kind of stuff that we have to be careful when we use language that, particularly in a time of conflict. So he's talking about, you can see here, in the blood that warms and animates my existence shall be poured out as drink for the Union. I mean, he's posing himself as Samson here, taking on these ridiculous Republicans. Well, regardless, it backfires so bad that a group in Congress, who were the minority, I always emphasize this, these two guys were not what most Republicans were. These were men who had been diehard abolitionists before the war, and now they were in power. And so, in other words, Lincoln was not a radical. In fact, most Republicans weren't radicals. But because this backfired so much, these two guys are going to take over. So if you look to the left, you may recognize this fella. The last time we really talked about him, he was getting his head beat in. So you may recognize just from that Charles Sumner. So make sure you know him. Charles Sumner is now one of the radicals in the Joint Committee on Reconstruction. The man in charge is the fellow on the right, Thaddeus Stevens. And Stevens, by the way, just a little bit about him. I know he looks particularly angry in this picture. He was cue ball bald, just totally bald. So that's a wig that he's wearing there. He was the author of the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. He wrote it. He had a common law wife, that means not official wife, who was black. He was married to a black woman who pretended to be his servant so that they would live in the house together, but they were actually married under his identity, under his standards. So he was very, very pro-civil rights, very, very pro-African-American. He was buried in an African-American cemetery. And he does not view the South as something that should kiss and make up. He wants to punish the South. Sumner, who got his head beat in, also wants to punish the South. So these are not two guys that are looking to forgive. Now, keep in mind, that's not the consistent view of the Republicans. But because they got so successful in 1866 election, they're now in charge. So they actually got more radicals as a result of Andrew Johnson. So they're going to completely redefine Reconstruction. And so when we call Reconstruction by name, it is usually referred to as either radical Reconstruction, congressional Reconstruction, or military Reconstruction. So be aware of all three of those terms. Radical meaning the group in Congress that wrote it, congressional meaning not presidential, and military meaning that's what they used to do Reconstruction. So all civil authorities, that means sheriffs, mayors, boards of supervisors, school boards, were under military supervision. So this is going to convert the South into a military occupation. All Southern states had to rewrite their constitutions, guaranteeing black suffrage, and they had to vote in favor of the 13th and 14th Amendments. So this is a far cry from what Johnson and Lincoln had proposed. And they were going to use troops to guarantee blacks could vote and be part of this. So in other words, in states like Mississippi and South Carolina, blacks would not only be a part of it, they would be the majority. Okay. And so that's going to change fundamentally. And this is exactly what Southerners have been afraid of. This is black power, so to speak, black rule. Now, population, though, we would say it's majority rule, but this is exactly what they were afraid of. And to do it required the heavy presence of the military. So this is why we usually call this military Reconstruction. Now, the irony of this is it's unconstitutional. You can't have military courts where there is a presence of civilian courts. In other words, militarily, the government can't run society vis-a-vis the military, particularly not ordinary civilians. The only people who get tried in military tribunals historically are soldiers, but now under military reconstruction, the military is running the judicial system of the South. And the Supreme Court in a case called Ex parte Milligan said, you can't do that, and they did it anyway. It's one of those things where it's like, okay, but never mind. So again, this is, the Supreme Court didn't revisit it. They didn't take any more challenges to this. So you have 5 military districts. We here in Virginia were military district number 1. Okay. And so you can see down in Texas, Florida, Tennessee didn't have to do this. Tennessee did what was required of it immediately. And so Tennessee comes right back into the Union, so to speak. But you can see when it comes to South Carolina, Mississippi, as late as Florida, 1877, right? Which, by the way, is the end of Reconstruction. So keep that in mind. All right, so the last part of the civil rights for African Americans would be created and enshrined in the 15th Amendment. And, the simplest definition of the 15th Amendment says the right to vote in America will not be denied based on race. Simple enough. So this guarantees Black people's right to vote. The problem is, again, for feminists, for women's rights advocates, there is no mention of gender or sex in this. And that would have been one word. You could just add one word like race, gender, color, or previous. You could have done that, race, sex, whatever, but they didn't. And so, again, women's rights groups are furious over both the 14th and 15th Amendment. I don't have a definitive answer other than it really wasn't on the radar of Congress to give women the right to vote, to guarantee women. They just weren't. They weren't attuned to that as a need or something they wanted to do. And so I would be familiar with all 3 amendments. Okay. And as a result, you have this. So I wanted you to make note of this. I don't think it's on my study guide, but you can certainly add it to 28 here. You had women who had very vocally, keep in mind, during the Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, the largest groups of people to oppose slavery were women. Large numbers of women who were abolitionists in the reform movement. But once the 14th Amendment included the word male, they felt like they had been betrayed. They felt like their support of African American men, particularly, was left behind. Frederick Douglass will famously tell Susan B. Anthony, like, one battle at a time. So she says, I will never work for any rights for Negroes that do not include women. This is not, they lost the struggle, they felt like that. And it will be, if you think about it, it will be, 55 years later, long after Susan B. Anthony dies, before women's rights are guaranteed. Just the women's right to vote is guaranteed. I want to mention, since I mentioned the League there, I do want to go back and mention something that I'm not sure if your book mentions or not, but it is relevant to this up here. So I talked about the American Missionary Association, right? One of the things I'd like you to be familiar with is a group called the Union League. So once these, and remember, these things are moving very quickly, right? These laws are being passed very quickly. So once the right to vote is guaranteed, there will be a group that is formed to help Black people vote, learn how to vote, be voters. And so today, the longest lasting African American civic organization is the NAACP, but that didn't exist then. So you should be familiar with the Union League, which I don't think I have it. Oh, I do have it. There it is. I thought it said, okay, so I definitely want you to be familiar with this group because, and so we'll come back to this at number 29. Yeah. So be sure you recognize that Ex parte Milligan did exist, but, military reconstruction still happened, in spite of the constitutional question. This will overwhelmingly be the outcome. So whenever the state does what military reconstruction said it was supposed to do, the military will leave. And as soon as it leaves, you have all white Democrat governments called Redeemer governments, or they're sometimes called Bourbon governments, okay? Bourbon governments. So these are the Confederates now back in charge in their states. Maybe not in Congress, but running these southern states. So as soon as As soon as the troops leave, like notice this year, right? Then this becomes reality. And Jim Crow, in many ways, will be the black codes all over again. So it's like we keep hitting the repeat button, right? And it just doesn't work, you know. So it's going to take radical changes in the 20th century to end this. Okay, so we call this period with Southerners a lot when blacks do have the right to vote. Military Reconstruction. This is Reconstruction. This is frequently a period that has been vilified in history. You had a historian. What's the fella's name? It'll come to me in a minute. But he back in the like 100 years ago, he wrote the defending Dunning. This guy's name, Dunning, and he wrote this sort of version of Reconstruction where blacks that were elected and white carpetbaggers and Southern scalawags were all grossly incompetent and corrupt and abused these Southern states until it ended. And then when it ended, things went back to the way they were supposed to be. You know, well, that became the mindset of what Reconstruction was. Like people, that's what they thought, you know, and that was the narrative. And so it's unfortunate because it's not factually accurate. But I did want to mention the Union League. So it begins in Philadelphia and it spreads to the South to try to help freedmen, particularly, learn how to be, in essence, citizens. So you think about it as Americans, we are educated from childhood to adulthood on civic duty and voting and, you know, what our responsibilities as citizens are. But if you're an African American who had been a slave, that's all news to you, you know. So teaching them how to not only how to vote, but who to vote for that would be in their interest and stuff like that. So this is the Union League. So it's the first group really who will actively advocate to encourage, support for America amongst free people, particularly. And so I want to mention that you have a remarkable thing. This fella here's name is Hiram Revels. And Hiram Revels and Bruce Blanche, who is, I'm not sure who Bruce Blanche is, but this is Hiram Revels. This is the delegation of African-American elected people to the U.S. Congress. And Hiram Revels, this fella, will be elected senator from Mississippi. And he will hold Jefferson Davis's seat. So in other words, the seat that used to be Jefferson Davis's Senate seat, the next person who's elected to it is a black man. So that's one of those interesting moments in history where the former Confederate is now, the seat of an African American. There were many people in the North who were critical of this. Harper's Weekly was just one of many sites that the thought of black people governing, and there is a powerfully propagandic film that is going to be made in the early 20th century called The Birth of a Nation, which gives a positive view of the Ku Klux Klan and a very critical view of these Reconstruction governments. And it will become sort of perpetuated, like this narrative of these incompetent people driving the government into the ground, so to speak. And that's this view. Now, who were your black participants? By and large, they were veterans. Okay. They were not very well prepared, obviously, for their role in politics. But they began voting and they began participating. However, there were people who, some cases, exploited them, but in many cases were here to help them. Unfortunately, the lines got blurred. So you had two terms that are, common by white people towards white people at this time in the South. Scalawag would have been a Southerner who did not support the Confederacy. A scalawag would have been a Southern white person who cooperated with these Reconstruction governments. Now, keep in mind, the Reconstruction Republican governments were not all black. I don't want to in any way think that. But they were often seen as made up of these people. So if it wasn't a black person, it was a scalawag or what was called a carpetbagger. A carpetbagger was seen as an exploitative person who migrated southward with the intent of exploiting Southerners, either getting their land or getting elected to office. Many of them, of course, were veterans who actually just came for an opportunity. But these two derisive terms really sort of lasted. Okay, so definitely be familiar with that. So I'm going to stop with this today, and we will finish on Monday this chapter, and you'll have the chapter quiz on Monday as well. Yeah, let me stop that now. And then if there's any questions on something you want to explain further,